Oh, forgot to hit that part. Oops. Somebody's out of practice. And there it is.
Please like and leave a heart. Please.
There we go. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Vigor Locksmith Show. I'm your host, David Gibson, here with you on another amazing Friday. So happy to have you guys here watching the show and here with us. Had a little bit of a technical screw up right there at the beginning, but hey, getting it out of the way. One interview at a time, one technical presentation at a time, and yeah, one technical screw up at a time. So this is the Vigor Locksmith Show where we are unlocking the secrets to success of the oil and gas industry. Yeah, just completely off my rhythm today. But so happy you guys are here with me. There was a whole bunch of comments that already come in, but I had to log out, log back in. For some reason, it looked like there was a bit of a delay. And so when I see a delay on there, I just can't help it. So if some of you guys already did comment, I apologize. Go ahead and throw it back up there. I know John DeWart did. I know a couple of others did. You have to just go back and put it in again so I can get you guys your shout out. So Robert, thanks for tuning in from hot Houston. I think it's hot everywhere right now. John Dahl, good morning from low country of South Carolina. Should be a good discussion. Wow, tuning in from South Carolina. Wow. All right. Oliver says, good morning from Woodlands, Texas. It's not in focus? It looks fine on my side. Tracy says, I'm out of focus. And then Danette says, good morning. Well, Danette, thank you for being here. Do appreciate it. All right. Like I said, guys, if you already put in some comments, you have to go back and do it again. There we go. The ever-present John DeWart says, good morning from Colorado. Thanks for being here. Jeff Chestnut says, hello from Houston. If you guys, please let me know where you guys are watching from. Let me know what you guys have been up to this summer. If anybody's taking any interesting vacations, would love to be able to hear about it. You know, it's a lot of fun to be able to do stuff here in, summer breaks. Christopher Bunk, sorry. Good morning from Houston, Texas. Thanks for being here. Duncan Gross is good morning from Houston. And as of this week, he's going to be coming onto the show, I think, 25th of August. Duncan's going to be coming on 25th of August. And we're going to be talking about acoustic telemetry. Really, really interesting stuff. He's been with the company. He's with Baker Hughes now. He started out with a company called Exact. I've been following that company for a very, very long time. So really interesting conversations will be taking place. Paul Moore says, good morning from Big Spring, Texas. Thanks for being here, sir. Mr. Pena tuning in from Bogota. Thanks for being here. Ahmed tuning in from Saudi. Good morning to you as well, sir. Naveed tuning in from Pakistan. Thanks for being here. Good morning. And Rabu says, good morning from Surfside Beach in Texas. Of all the things you can be doing at Surfside, and you're watching the Vigor Locksmith Show, that means a lot. I mean, just the simple fact that anybody watches the show, you guys could be, binging Netflix right now, and you're watching the show. It means a lot to me. Always does. All right. Robert Carrington says, hola from San Antonio. That's where I'm headed this weekend with the kids. We're going to go do Fiesta, Texas, some other things. Have a lot of fun there. And then Cruz says, good morning from College Station. We got people tuning in from all over. This is great stuff. All right, guys. Thank y'all so much. As per normal, if you guys want to win I got to get this into frame. All right. If you guys want to win yourself a drill bit, hashtag Gibson is the way to be able to do it. Still looking for a sponsor. If anybody wants to sponsor the show, until then, it's me sponsoring the show, right? Going to be giving away some drill bits. And we're actually, there's some drill bits being given away today at the Roughneck Boot Camp. So if you're watching this, you're probably not a part of that event. And if you're at that event, you're probably not watching this. But we're giving away some drill bits at that event. So that's for the SPE Gulf Coast section. Anyways, Hashtag Gibson. And then we'll play the intro for the How It's Done show. If you haven't seen it, season 1 is all there on YouTube. Go check it out. Season 2, we keep rolling through. The last episode was with Wellbore Integrity Services, Cruz. He's been on the show before, and he worked with them. We got a great behind-the-scenes look of all the different things they're doing there at the WIS. So here, check this out. And the next episode will be from a new park. So I don't know if that'll be next week, week after, when exactly it'll be, but it will be soon. So check it out. All right, there it is. That's the How It's Done show intro. Absolutely love hearing that intro. Gives me goosebumps every single time. Love the way that thing came together. And we'll see. So here everybody's putting in hashtag Gibson. Even people that already have drill bits trying to double up. All right. And yes, if it's Estes, it's got to be good. I agree. And I'll say this before I bring him on. I have heard... This is probably the first time that I've had somebody that I'm interviewing and had multiple people reach out to me and go, did you know he did this? Did you know he did this? And legitimately a bunch of things I didn't know about Robert before bringing him on the show. We've met, we've talked in person several times, but a lot of people really reached out and said, like, wow, this guy's a huge wealth of knowledge, which I expected, but then there were things within that I did not know. So really excited to be able to do this and bring on our guest of the day, Robert Estes. Robert, thank you so much for being here. I know you are a faithful watcher of the show as well and commenter, but it's absolutely an honor to be able to have you on the show today as our guest.
Well, thank you, David. You do a wonderful service for the industry with your show, and especially your How It's Made. I'm just in awe of your video and audio and studio capability. I wish I could be there in Wimberley with you today.
We can always do a makeup. You're always more than welcome to be able to come here to the studio. And so, maybe we'll just have one of these times where we get you and John DeWart and a couple of other guys all here at one time and just have a full round table of debates with you guys.
And, sounds like a party.
Yeah. There was somebody that said, so Craig Brown says, hey to Robert, SLB Learning Center, 1977.
You're right. Corpus Christi.
Yeah. So I had to throw that one out there. Okay. Robert, well, first of all, thank you for the kind comments. I have to be able to give a lot of credit to on the video series. All of that is done by my mom, who is a 30-year professional videographer, Emmy Award winner. So all of the real cool video stuff is done by her. The fact that I'm able to do this live streaming shows because I essentially was brought up in a household. I was not brought up in an oil field household. I was brought up in video and film household. So a lot of this is due to her credit. And now she's on a project in Europe filming stuff for the DSATS documentary. And she's off having fun there. So, but Robert, back to you, sir. For those who don't know who you are, give us, it could be as long and as lengthy a background intro as you want, but give us the intro on who you are.
Well, like you, I also was not brought up in the oil field. In fact, I was brought up as a farm boy. My daddy was a citrus grower in Florida, and that's where I learned so much about electromechanical things and using your hands. My father was actually a graduate in aeronautical engineering from MIT and worked on quite a few military things. For instance, the F-4 Phantom jet He was in charge of the flutter and the wing vibration on the F-4 Phantom jet and the first Atlas rocket out at San Diego for Convair, part of General Dynamics. And yet he left that engineering discipline to come back to the family business that had been for decades in citrus in Central Florida. And when he was there, he still did some electrical and mechanical and engineering wonders. He built, before I was born, for his parents. He built a home as general contractor. Of course, he contracted out the various plumbing and construction parts of it, but he embedded a subterranean geothermal exchange loop, a heat pump loop, back in 1950, which was at that time, I think, pretty forward-looking, futuristic. So to have an air conditioning system in Florida in 1950 was, back in then, everybody had only fans. So instead of just an attic fan, he put an actual central air conditioning system in with a tower, a cooling tower, evaporative cooling, and aided by a subterranean geothermal loop. So his expertise in engineering interested me. I was a tinkerer all the time, growing up, working as a farm boy on his citrus grove, driving tractors, doing all the mechanical stuff. That was my background. I didn't know anything about the oil field. In fact, I kind of thought that just like on Beverly Hillbillies, when they had Jed Clampett, who fired a shot and out come the oil bubbling from the ground, as far as I knew, that's how you found oil. So I was one of those reprobates that came into the oil field from a totally different industry, just as you were.
Well, I would say that's got to be a very interesting household, because a lot of people are going to say, "Oh, I grew up in a house without air conditioning," and then you grew up with a house with the air conditioning that your dad designed himself. So it's a little bit different from most people, how they would kind of tell stories about their childhood. So how did you first get into the oil and gas industry?
Well, that was a good story as well. I was an electrical engineering student at University of Florida. I was a Gator. And I interviewed with a number of electrical companies, Intel, Square D, Power, Electronics. Wasn't certain what I wanted to do. And then along came this interviewer from Schlumberger at career days there at University of Florida. Bud Bell said, "You seem to be somebody who's really active with your working with your hands, and you like to be a hands-on engineer. Why don't you come on and be a field engineer offshore for Schlumberger?" And I said, "Schlumberger, what's that? Do they make burgers, hamburgers?" Of course, everybody wonders that. I didn't know anything about it. And he said, "Well, you don't want to sit behind a desk all your career, do you? Don't you want to get out there and work with your hands?" I said, "Sure, that sounds very appealing." So for a college guy like me, it sounded great. I got on an airplane, went to New Orleans, first time I'd been on a commercial air flight, drove down to Houma, Louisiana, and got in a big blue logging truck and went with Melvin Picu out to an oil rig. First time I ever saw one. For the next 2 days we spent in that truck, and I slept on the floor of Melvin's truck while he was attaching log headings and filling out log headings onto his logs of open hole logging for Schlumberger. And that was my introduction to it. It was alien and appealing. And I thought, this sounds interesting. And I signed up. So that's how I got into it. But I was working, as Craig Brown said, we went to a training school. Schlumberger did a very good job for training its new entry engineers. And we spent about 3 months down in Corpus Christi learning all the equipment, how it works technically, how to make it work, the things that we have to do at the rig site to ensure good quality control. And all of that was very interesting to us engineers. And I went to work in Morgan City offshore, worked there in the very height of the big oil boom following the Arab embargo. Money was no object. All the companies were throwing money at drilling and logging and completing wells and trying to get that precious commodity oil to the surface. And in Morgan City, I met the love of my life, Anne Marie, my wife. So my family and our three children, I owe to the oil field as well. And I thank God and the oil field for providing me and blessing me for all of these years.
Wow. So tell us a little bit about like your first little bit. So obviously you started kind of on the wireline side. I know that now throughout your career, you've been able to focus more on directional drilling and drilling. So what were some of the early years there, and how did you end up into the MWD and directional drilling space?
Well, Schlumberger had a Schlumberger Technology Corporation on Schlumberger Drive here in Houston. And they dabbled in a lot of technologies. One of the things that they were interested in was MWD. And here I was working in their mainstream business, wireline logging out of Morgan City. And yet I heard about this new division, measurement while drilling, that was starting up in Sugar Land, Texas. So I signed up to go into measurement while drilling when it was an infant business. I mean, today, you know that the Schlumberger campus in Sugar Land is huge. I think they had well over 7,000 people there at one time, employees. I have no idea how large it is today. But in 1978, when I went in with the very small crew of MWD, which was about 40 people, we had about 40 people, one big bay mechanical assembly area, and an office suite. And then there was the Johnston Testers building on Industrial Road. That's all that Schlumberger had in Sugar Land. And it grew from 1978 to what's today is nearly a small city.
Very true. That's actually where I did my Eng 1 course, was there. So what were some of the early projects that you worked on?
Well, MWD in those days had been adapted from a patent and gravelly patent working for Mobil. So the Mobil mud siren was licensed by Schlumberger Technology, and they moved that out of the Schlumberger Road, Telephone Road headquarters, and they transferred all of that, including the research people, hired some new engineers from AT&T Bell Labs and a number of oil field folks to work on and developing this new MWD. And I was working on that. So I was there basically in the field testing. I started out as a trainer, as a field engineer for MWD, then in training new field engineers. The plan back then was to hire graduate engineers because Schlumberger had found out that, number one, their method of operation, well logging, when you send a logging unit or a logging truck to a well site when they need to be logged, they do the logging business, they spend the hours that it takes to do that, maybe a day, and then they pack up and they leave. That business model was totally different from measurement while drilling, which is devoted to drilling. It's more like the drilling crew, where you have to be on site, on presence, everything rigged up, completely working daily for many, many days or weeks in order to complete the well. So with that focus, they knew that they needed to have a different business model and a different type of field engineer. And they bought a mud logging company because mud loggers are on site analyzing the mud, the cuttings that come up from the mud, and finding out geologically where they are, not just mechanically where we are in drilling versus depth. And so those geologists in the Analyst, which was the company that Schlumberger bought, it became the Analyst MWD. And then that was the forerunner to their Anadrill division, which came later on after I had left. But while it was the Analyst, they found out that the mudloggers did not have the same capability to learn and understand the technical interactions of the modules in the MWD, measurement while drilling, as did graduate engineers. So they began to hire graduate engineers who needed to then be schooled in geology and the basics of drilling I became the trainer for that, set up a training program, had a couple of assistant trainers, and we had every 3 months, we had a new group of trainees coming in, graduate engineers interested to go to work in the 78, 79, 1980 time frame, and to begin doing this work. Back then, it was strange. The surface computer for MWD was an HP 9825 calculator. It had a storage medium for the entire well, which was about a 1 inch by 2 inch tape. Looks like a little audio tape. But on that digital tape, it would store all of the information associated with drilling that we could get at the time. At the time, the Schlumberger mud siren, which was state of the art back then, would generate about 24 hertz, and from that they would get 1 bit or 2 every couple of seconds, and in high speed mode they would get as much as 8 bits per second. But typically 1 to 4 bits per second was the standard. Now, today we're talking about 1 to 4 gigabits per second on our modems in our houses, and it went megabit before that. But we're talking about 1 to 4 bits per second. You know, that MWD transmission rate was sustained for decades. We only really got into the much higher data bit rates in the on the mud pulse system in the past 15 years.
So wait, this was early 80s, 78.
Yeah, 1978 up to 1981 when I left Schlumberger.
And you guys were doing somewhere between 1 and 4 bits per second.
That's right.
That is still the standard today. That is still what's happening with the. Oh my.
And the reason for it, David, is the medium. Whereas you can go faster and faster through air or vacuum when you have a sluggish mud fluid medium, and that's where you have to transmit your data. That's the constraining force. You just can't alter because it's not water. You can have sonar in a submarine. You can talk for miles and miles and miles because water is basically an incompressible fluid. But mud is a non-Newtonian fluid. It's compressible. It's spongy, and it's difficult to send a signal through. So we've made some dramatic improvements, I think. We're up to perhaps 24 bits per second in some of the best of the MWD systems today, but that's not generally standard. And it doesn't happen from top to bottom in the deepest wells.
It blows my mind that now obviously we do have like higher end tools, whether it be wired drill pipe or the siren pulse systems, but the vast majority of US land MWD components are operating somewhere between half a bit to potentially 4 bits per second on the high end. Some people claim 4 bits per second, but in actuality, they're probably not even doing that, right? Or at least if they are, they're only doing it down to like, surface casing point, 2,000 to 3,000 feet deep. So just like
that's right.
We haven't advanced the whole group of the technology to a point to where we're beyond what we were doing 40 years ago at state of the art phase. So that's just,
Well, we have other options. They're somewhat limited. I often like to compare the MWD. Here's a downhole measurement while drilling device. I like to compare that to a NASA space probe to Mars, for instance. You have this satellite that's out there on its own. It's got its power source. It's been pre-programmed. It's got sensors. It has a capability that can talk back. You have limited capability to control it. And it takes sometimes minutes in order to get data transfer. So it's very similar to that. Here's this measurement while drilling thing that's down there, and it can only communicate through this very slow mud pulse link. literally, and for those who are watching that aren't familiar with drilling and measurement while drilling, it's like when you were a little kid and your brother went to the backside of the house where the water hose was. You had a water hose and you were sprinkling water, and he would squeeze the hose and stop it. And then the water would stop flowing, right? You look in the hose, say, what's going on? And then he turned the hose on. Well, if you had a pressure gauge at the faucet, you would see the pressure increase as he squeezed the water hose, and then the pressure would come back up as he let it go. And that change in pressure by squeezing or constricting the flow of mud and then opening it is the basic way that we communicate in MWD today after 40 years or more. Golly, this was 47 years ago when I started in MWD. That's how that was done. Teleco and started that in 1980. 1980 was a banner year, I guess. That was when at least 4 companies went commercial with measurement while drilling. There was Schlumberger with their mud siren, the fastest of them. There was Teleco, which was funded by aerospace companies and had a very rugged, if heavy duty and brute force pulser, again, mud pulse. There was the Christianson group that I went to, Christianson Diamond, using a Vectel negative pulse mud system, where they opened a vent to divert and thereby lower the pressure instead of constricting the flow of mud and having a positive pressure. There was Xlog, who became Baker Hughes. And there may be others, and Gearhart, I think, about the same time. All of these 5 companies went commercial with measurement while drilling companies, which were transmitting data measured downhole, powered by batteries, to the surface. And Schlumberger was in the lead at that time using a turbine alternator. And the main reason for that was that they had power-hungry components that they had just converted from wireline. They had not yet optimized the electronic load so that they could survive on battery power alone.
And there's still actually essentially the basis of that is still there today with a lot of their systems. Now, some of the tools do have batteries built into them, but a lot of their higher end systems still run the siren turbine system there. Okay, yeah. So we've got a handful of great comments in here. Sean Cuff said state of the art at the time. Eric says, I remember this 1 to 4, this time of 1 to 4 bits per second. Eric also said it's the mud's fault again. LOL. Jerry says MWD is still a commodity business. A lot of truth to be said to that. And then Robert Carrington said majors were hiring degree engineers as well as teaching them petroleum engineer. Unical hired a mechanical engineer from Rice University, worked for me. Obviously, Schlumberger relaxed on that graduate level engineer when they hired me. And then, promptly let me go 2 years later. And the Daryl Chicken says first job was Gearhart negative pulse tool.
Right.
And then Jack Taylor says 78 to 15. He was Teleco 78 to 15. Thanks for the nod. So then tell us. So obviously you started there with Schlumberger and then moved over to Christianson, you said?
Yes, I was, like I told you, I had been a field engineer for wireline, then a field engineer for MWD. Then I was the trainer for MWD. And boy, the turnover, somebody mentioned this, you hire graduate engineers because the folks who were geologists, the geologists and the analysts that went to work in MWD, or even if they were just mud loggers, they were looking to get into the major oil field operating companies. But these oil field operating companies weren't going to hire anybody without field experience. So the mud logging companies were plagued with geologists who came on board, started working. They were 3 or 4 months into the field, and then they immediately left and went to a job working for Shell or Exxon or Mobil or BP because those were better paying jobs, but they needed that experience. And as a result, those who were training people in the mud logging companies to be MWD operators were then having trouble with replacements. We had a turnover rate approaching 700% in 1979. It was ridiculous. So, but we were talking about telemetry. There are other options in telemetry. I went to Christianson Diamond, which was still using mud pulse telemetry coming down from Calgary, Alberta. There was a group called Gentrix, and then they became Vectel, and Vectel had a negative pulse system. Christianson Diamond wanted to get into that business. They were in the mining diamond business, and then they went into petroleum drilling diamond drilling bits. Christianson diamond bits are very well known in the industry. And they wanted to get into measurement while drilling. So they bought this or merged with this company, Vectel. And that was the negative mud pulse system. And they wanted to start a new business, a measurement while drilling business called Christianson MWD in Salt Lake City. So I left Houston, the oil field capital, went to the mountains of Utah, and came back 10 years later. We kept saying it's going to be next year. And my poor wife, who was looking forward to next year, spent 10 winters in Utah. She never lets me forget that.
Of all the spots to be based as far as in the oil field, I figured Utah would have been one of the nicer spots. But if you like where it's warm, it's not the place to be.
Utah, I loved. It was beautiful. It's scenic. The snow is not so bad. My dad had told me about how bad snow was because he was in Boston for MIT. And he says it's nasty, it's cold, it's wet, it turns ice and dirty, and you got to shovel it, and it's heavy. And then I experienced the powder snow in Utah, and I said, this is not so bad. It would snow at 6 or 7 in the morning, and by 10 a.m. it had all melted away. I said, what's the matter, Dad? You were wrong on this. But it's a totally different situation. Snow in the Rockies is different from snow back east.
Oh, interesting. So, okay, we'll continue on with the thing here. Let me, I got a couple of other comments in here. John DeWart says, tested first Gearhart tool in the Netherlands, late 1970s. Great experience with Monroe Knight.
Right.
Jag Taylor says, Telecom hired aerospace engineers from Emory-Riddle early on. Great minds there. It was hard sell to the old guard, but that expanded the perspective. Has paid in spades. And then best snow in the world is Wasatch. Not real sure where that's at, Duncan, but I'll take your word for it. All right, so you finally get back to Houston. Let's pick up there. What happens next?
Well, the Wasatch Mountains was the big mountain range in Salt Lake City Valley. In Salt Lake Valley is the Wasatch Mountains, where they have all the ski resorts, Snowbird, Alta, Brighton, these, I think 6 or 7. Within 20 miles of my house when I lived there, there were 6 or 7 very well-known ski resorts. But what I got into in Christianson, they were very much into technology. They started the measurement while drilling with a negative mud pulse, but they were also aware of other technologies. And we hired a crew from Wireline, from Gearhart. We had some aerospace people. We had a number of people who came in from other industries and started this core that became Christianson MWD. 1986, we merged with Eastman Whipstock, so it became Eastman Christianson. And then there are lots of mergers through the 80s, which was, I started in 81 there, and through the 84, 85, 86 period was a very bad depression in the oil field industry. People had said for years that oil field is a good counter-cyclical industry to aerospace, because when aerospace is up, then the oil field is down. When oil field is down, aerospace is up. The 1980s put an end to that because both industries were severely depressed. There were engineers looking for jobs everywhere. We survived and we grew, and we began looking for expansion. And in 1990, Baker Hughes, which had merged a few years before that, Baker and Hughes bought Eastman Christianson, and we became a Baker Boys at that point. So that's when I moved back to Houston in 1990. In the meantime, Salt Lake City and the industry had given us 3 children, one of each type, I like to say. We had a natural-born son born in Houston. We adopted a son in Salt Lake City. And then we had a test tube baby girl in Salt Lake City in one of the early fertility programs there. So I went away with a wife to Salt Lake City, and I came back with a family to Houston. In the meantime, we had experienced and investigated all these other telemetries, not just mud pulse, but acoustic telemetry. We looked into electromagnetic telemetry, which you know very well is an aiding capability today. And we looked at wired pipe, a number of other means of communication. But still today, getting data from downhole to the surface is a slow business unless you invest in the mechanical interconnections to give you an electrical connection by wired pipe. That's the way you get high speeds. We talk about high speeds today, it's like 9600 baud, the kind of things that were archaic modems 40 years ago in communications. But for downhole, that's state of the art today. But you don't get that with any of the other options that are convenient. And the convenient option is mud pulse because you don't interfere with the drilling operation at all. So we came back to Houston. Baker had then inherited or bought about 5 different MWD companies, merged them all together. They had Develco, which was a supplier of instruments from San Jose. They had Eastman Christianson, which was a full-fledged development and operations MWD business. They merged Eastman into that. They had their own Baker MWD at the time. And then they bought Teleco, which was the first, the premier MWD company that was very well established. And all of these companies merged together. And of course, we had the problem of sorting out personnel, management, marketing, and technology. And the technology is, of course, where I was involved. I'd been involved in the directional MWD part of it for, well, since 1978. So well more than a decade at that time. And I guess the turning point to me, the most important part of my background in directional was the realization that we had an antiquated way of calibrating and verifying calibration. So one of the things I'm proudest of is what we call total field calibration. In 1984, Phil Walters at Tinzer and I did the first of a series of SPE papers and presentations on how you could improve calibration of a 3-axis accelerometer, 3-axis magnetometer to determine position in this remote spacecraft-like MWD module downhole. And that was a breakthrough, I think, and it's prolific in the industry today. We've realized that by use of those 3 axes, X, Y, and Z, you can calibrate just by orienting the device itself in a fixed earth field. So we introduced that, we documented it, had a paper on it. It was all public. There was no patents on it, and it's been adopted in the oil field. And I'm very proud that we use that still today in all of the companies that I worked for. It's a very effective and accurate and scalable way to calibrate directional modules.
And see, that was something I had no idea about. And it was Thomas Palmer, who's, they're commenting, they're having a little conversation over here. He was the one to reach out to me and said, "Did you know?" And so tell me a little bit about that. Like, where did that idea come from?
Well, we had started at Schlumberger. Schlumberger was making their own magnetometer, but they were one of the first to realize that accelerometers, which are the basis of determining where you are with respect to gravity, were important. And they began to use aerospace accelerometers, what we call Q-Flex, quartz flexure accelerometers that were supplied at that point by Sunstrand Data Precision. for lots of aeronautic and aircraft. Sunstrand became Allied Signal, and later on bought Honeywell and became Honeywell. They're still supplied today. That is the most important sensor in the oil field. And I'll still stand by the point that if you look at measurement while drilling, the most important sensor is the directional. And the reason for that is that even today, with all these other sensors and even with geosteering, if you lose the directional, they're not going to drill very long without tripping to replace it. But any other sensor, whether it's gamma or density or sonic or whatever, if those go out, likely they'll make a determination whether they can live without it and continue to drill until the life of the drill bit or the life of the motor or something else expires. So the directional is most important. And that's the genesis of MWD. At the time in 1970s, to find out where the drill bit was, you had to laboriously and tediously over time take the pipe. Here you have, say, 10,000 feet of pipe with a drill bit at the bottom in an unknown position, because it doesn't go just straight down. We found out a long time ago that it meanders. We can try to control it, but we don't know where it is if we don't track it. They would have to lower a directional instrument through the drill pipe on a wire. It was battery powered or powered from the surface. It would make measurements, and you would bring that back to the surface. And literally back then, it was a snapshot. And when we're talking about a directional snapshot, do you know, David, that what it used to be literally was a snapshot on photographic film? That's why they called it that, because they would take a snapshot. And the photographic film was a small disc that was exposed by light when you turned it on, and the light would project over a hanging pendulum, and the pendulum would show the deviation from the center, and the deviation from the center then was the inclination or the drift, and the direction of that inclination was the azimuth. That's how you would tell where the drill bit was pointing. All of that took a long time, maybe from half an hour to 2 hours in a deep well. And MWD immediately came in and said, I'm going to take that 2 hours that you spent to try to get that one snapshot, and I can do it while you change the drill pipe in just a couple of minutes' time. And that was the big breakthrough. MWD's breakthrough was replacing wireline lowered directional snapshots. And we grew from there. We got better and better accuracy and continuous measurements. Lots of things grew from that. But the basis of MWD is replacing tedious directional wireline single shot measurements.
Wow. I have to read this comment real quick. Josh Stewart says, protect Robert at all costs. This guy is a gym library of knowledge. So much is going on in here. So I want to be able to, where was it? So Brett says, Total Fill allowed you to use test stands that were reasonably priced. They only had to hold an orientation and move to all orientations. They didn't need to be oriented.
Exactly right.
So how did it feel for you after putting that paper out and then seeing the adoption across the industry of that new methodology?
Well, that was nice. I remember very much the transition from the tedious way that Schlumberger oriented and calibrated their magnetometers, and setting up a field that they tried to control and moving the magnetometer in the field. Then we moved to Christianson and the folks from Canada, like Bechtel, Canadians from Calgary. They had a elaborate fixture that was rotated on a granite block. And the sensor at the time, a 3-axis accelerometer sensor, looked like, they called it the Star Wars sensor because it looked like a starship or something. But it was oriented horizontal. Then they would roll it every 90 degrees on this granite block, taking positive and negative measurements from each of the X, the Y, and the Z axes, and calibrate by the methods, the measurements that were made from those. But all of that meant that the fixturing and the granite block and the leveling and all of that required very, very high quality control. And Brett's right. When we transitioned to total field calibration, the only thing that was important was that it didn't matter whether it was really pointing horizontal or really to north, as long as it was constant and you could roll it around the axis of interest smoothly. So we built a lot of tubular cylinders. We used V blocks, where you take your cylindrical instrument, lay it in the V blocks, and just roll it. And that ensured that we could have constant axis. We weren't wobbling around that axis. As long as you can do that, then as long as you can control the external field, and there's nothing really more stable than the Earth's gravity field. So if you're rotating in the Earth's gravity field and you don't disturb the Earth's magnetic field, you can rely on Mother Earth as the reference source to calibrate your instruments. And we did that. And Tensor began doing that. George Roberts and Bob Waters and Phil Walters in Austin, Texas were doing that in the 1980s, early 80s. And they were doing that and making a superior magnetometer. And we wondered, well, why is it so much better? I went down there, investigated, I saw how they did it, and they literally had a big round plywood target. It looked like a dartboard. And the sensor was stuck on V blocks on that dartboard, and they'd spin it around this plywood disc. And that was the calibration. And I said, well, you can't possibly have high quality calibration with plywood fixtures. And yet they were producing some of the best sensors in the industry. A little bit more investigation helped me understand the physics of it. And we went on a world tour. We went to Aberdeen SPE section. We went down to Houston. We generated a paper and presented a paper in San Antonio in 1989, I think. And that was total field calibration. And it is, as we say today, it's prolific because it works everywhere. It requires simple fixtures. We can do it anywhere in the world. When I left Baker at the time, they had 25 different calibration locations around the world, including out in the Siberian and even in the outback. And it doesn't take anything other than a wooden shack in order to do that. The one thing I think I regret on that is that so many companies who implement total field calibration have the same mindset that Philip and Tensor did as manufacturing organizations. In manufacturing, all you want to do is calibrate it. If you're an operating company, you want to be able to verify the calibration. And the real important part of total field calibration is verifying the accuracy of the digital corrected data. That means not just deriving the corrections and applying the corrections and then assuming that those corrections are being applied properly. It means that you can take the corrected data, feed it back through the same algorithm, analyze it, and see what's left. That's the real value of it. Because when I looked at so many systems and the various companies I worked through over the years, every single one of them had some flaws in the digital code. It's either the digital hardware or the digital code implementation to apply this model. And some of them were applying it in the wrong direction. We went down to look at the Xlog tool when we merged with Baker Hughes and Eastman Christianson, and the Xlog tool had been applying a couple of the misalignments in the wrong direction, which meant that their calibration was not improving the results. It was making it double the error that it was before. Never knew that. And if you don't get an opportunity to examine these sorts of things, then you don't know that. So to me, my career, I guess, breakthrough or the thing that I remember and was most valuable is that testing at the system level is the most important thing. If you build anything and you can't test it at the system level, then you're making compromises and you're making assumptions. So you've got to try your best to test things at the system level. Those companies that do the best job of system level testing at the collar level, the product that we're actually going to deploy to the drill rig, those are the companies that are most successful.
Wow. This is So much information, so much that we're learning here. Okay, so tell me about your time then there with. I mean, we're already almost an hour in. So tell me about your time then with Halliburton, what you did with them.
Well, I spent 5 years with Schlumberger. Mostly the last four were MWD. Then I went 34 and a half years with Baker before they laid me off. And then I actually worked with Evolution Engineering, another Canadian company, for about 3 months. But then Halliburton picked me up for a new project, designing a new modular MWD, LWD platform. And I designed a directional MWD for Halliburton. And 6 years at Halliburton, and that meant at the end, that was 46 years in the oil field. So I finally retired in February. I got a new business card. Here you go. Maybe you can see this. Retired. Ask somebody else. It's not not my job anymore. My daughter printed up these business cards for me. Don't call, don't email.
Not my
Retired.
problem.
Not my problem. Right. So finally, actually, I'm still active. I'm still on podcasts. I'm still volunteering for SPE, IEEE subgroups and functions. I'm an advisor on the STAT committee, the Science and Technology Advisory Team for the Utah Forge geothermal group. And so I'm trying to stay active. So this is my 47th year of somewhat active participation in the oil field.
Well, I do appreciate it, and I'm glad that you're still doing some volunteering and helping out. So, in all of your experience, then what do you think is coming next?
Well, there's a lot of talk about alternative energy, renewable energy. We don't have a energy transition going on. What we have is an energy diversification. I've heard that word before, and it's appropriate. We really do need to have more diversification into energy. But the hype for renewables has been overhyped. The renewables, especially those that work in the wind and the sun, solar and wind. Texas is a leader in that, and yet we've seen with ERCOT's management problems that's introducing an issue. When you have some customers who expect 24/7 electrical power, you can't replace 24/7 electrical power with power that only works when the wind blows or when the sun shines. And we've seen that, and it's getting worse. So the more percentage of renewables supplying your grid, the worse. Fossil fuels are here. They've been our life-sustaining and technology-advancing core for the last century. They will be very important for the next century, not just decades, and certainly not 5 years. Al Gore and Greta notwithstanding. And we have an ample supply of fossil fuels. There are plenty of oil and gas deposits around the world yet to be discovered. In some cases, we need new technology or better technology to produce those. But I'm struck by the fact that when I was a kid, the price of oil, meaning a price of petrol or gasoline, was approximately the same as the price of milk. You could get a gallon of milk for 25 cents, and it was about 25 cents for a gallon of gasoline. Then in high school, I noticed that it was about 59 cents for a gallon of milk and 59 or 60 cents for a gallon of gasoline. And these prices have moved up and down over the years, depending upon supply, demand, government subsidies, and technology. But I can tell you today that when we have 400 drilling rigs in the United States that are producing and enabling production of 10 million barrels of oil per day, that's a lot. And that 400 drilling rigs is doing the job of 4,000 drilling rigs back in the peak of the 1980s. So if we've got 10 times less drilling rigs and we're getting more production, that means that technology is enabling us to do better exploration, better finding, and better extraction and production. And I imagine the same thing happens in agriculture, but there's a basic limitation. You can't get 10 times as much milk out of a cow today as you could 40 years ago. You can get more, I'm sure, and there are ways to do better, but it's the technology in more ways than not that's advancing our ability to continue using oil and gas, and we will continue to do that. We look around the United States and think, well, we need to cut back, but we don't. Well, we really don't, because we are the producer of agriculture for the world. We're the producer of aerospace products for the world, and we're the biggest producer of oil and gas for the world. And that's important because the world needs those products. The world needs more oil and gas. 3 billion people really don't have access to the oil and gas technology that we have today. And they need it, not just for fuel, but also for products. So we will continue for my lifetime and your lifetime using and relying on fossil fuels, and it will continue to grow.
Excellent. All right. Well, before I get off too far into some of the questions I've got, there's been a couple asked here. Let's see. Josh Stewart says, is wired pipe too fast considering you can only drill so fast?
Can't be too fast. Can you get data into your home too fast? Do you think that your fiber optic link for intranet or Wi-Fi is too fast? No, nobody's going to complain about too fast. Can you take advantage of it? Yes, we're getting computers that can take advantage of real-time data from downhole. Even on wired pipe, you can talk with the prime users in the North Sea of wired pipe, Equinor, BP, Conoco. These companies that do invest in using wired pipe are still finding themselves limited. They would like to pack more data per minute of time of drilling than they can today by the wired pipe, even though it's up in the megabit per second range. So yes, it would be good to get more data. Yes, it would be good to get more data to the surface. And wired pipe is not too fast.
All right. This one's from LinkedIn user, so I'm not really sure who. I'd like to know, what is one fundamental aspect of drilling you wish was considered an unquestionable truth?
And probably if you look at the lay person who looks at the oil field industry, they don't realize that every single oil well is drilled with a target in mind. There's a plan. So much of the general public still thinks our industry is, you invest in a drilling rig, you put a bit and a lot of pipe in the hole, and you rotate it, you drill it, and you cross your fingers and you hope for oil. And maybe you picked a good site because you had some clues nearby, but all you're doing is drilling and hoping. It's not the way it works. The fundamental truth of drilling is that every well has a target or multiple targets. We transitioned from vertical drilling to slant drilling, where we tried to expand from a single location and get more of a large flat reservoir of oil. And then we went to horizontal drilling, where we drill down and then go horizontal. And the whole point was to get maximum exposure of the drill pipe to the resource. The resource is the oil. Well, Mother Nature in sedimentary basins lays out these flat pancakes of oil or gas or hydrocarbon, and the hydrocarbon is above the water, but it's trapped and it's in basically big flat pancakes. You get more production if you go down, go horizontal, and you horizontally expose a mile or more of pipe to your resource, as opposed to, if it's 10 feet thick, if you go straight through it, you have only 10 feet of production zone instead of 1,000 or 5,000, or on Sakhalin Island, thousands of feet, miles of exposure to the reservoir target. So we went from one target to multiple targets to a long extended target. And this was enabled by not just directional control, but geosteering, where we're geologically following the measurements measured by gamma rays and resistivity So we knew where the oil was, we knew where the water was in this sedimentary rock, and we could follow this oil zone above the water and keep it in the oil zone, not just for 100 feet or 1,000 feet, but for literally miles through a very large pancake of production zone. So the unquestionable truth to me that is probably unknown to the lay person is that every well is planned. Every well is planned based on the best of technical and geological and geophysical measurements. And the plan is to hit the target. And my job has been, in my 47 years, enabling tools to help us hit those targets.
Excellent. All right, we'll keep running off with all the comments and questions that we got here in the comment section. How much does temperature mess up the sensor readings? For example, if downhole temp exceeds my tool temp rating, will my survey data be messed up?
Very good point. And that's another of the unquestionable truths in the oil field. The deeper you go, the hotter it is. And there are only a certain number of high temperature components available. When you look at these directional MWD and then the more elaborate LWD tools, they have lots of electronic components and sensors packed inside of there. We have access to a lot of different technologies to build these sensors, but most of them come from aerospace or automotive more recently, and they have limitations in temperature. We calibrate all of our equipment against temperature so that it's just as accurate at room temperature as it is at 100 degrees C or even 200 degrees C. But you ask a very good question. What if you have a well bore that's 225 degrees C and your sensors can only go to 200 C? Well, now what do you do? What we do is extrapolate. We actually calibrate or extrapolate from the sensor measurements that we make. If we're going to go into a 225 degree C well, we actually know that well in advance. And even though our sensor might be calibrated only 200 degrees C, we can test it. And we can test it in the lab at 225 degrees C. We can find out how it behaves, and we can characterize it to that temperature, even though that temperature is beyond its manufacturer's rated range. So another one of those unknown truths, which is immutable, is that every MWD tool today is running with some components that are running beyond their manufacturer's rated specs. Why is that? Because we have thousands, not dozens or hundreds, we have thousands of components, and many of those components just are not manufactured with a high temperature rating that may be required in a deep hot well for hydrocarbons, and especially for those deep hot wells for geothermal. I got involved in geothermal in Baker Hughes, which had been in geothermal for decades. So back maybe 20 years ago or more, I've been working with the Department of Energy, a number of what they call FOAs or grants, experiments and research projects to develop very high temperature for geothermal, 300 degrees C, which is about 600 Fahrenheit, much hotter than you would ever use to bake your cookies or cake. But we expect instruments to operate at 300 degrees C. And we've actually produced some that will reliably operate at 300 degrees C. But the key is we've produced some. Where we might need, for the entire suite of measurements we'd like to make, we might need 5,000 components. We might actually only have 10 or 20 components that will reliably operate at 300 degrees C. So it's building that system that's complex and then testing subsystems, validating those subsystems that we know that we've picked and chosen and cherry picked to get those parts that'll work to high temperature, putting it all together. And the rule of reliability is that the ultimate system reliability is the product of the reliabilities of the subcomponents. So the more complex it is, the more you combine together, the more likely you're going to have failure.
Well, Brett says in response to that, it was such a come down when mil spec became less of a market pool when the Cold War ended. Had to really hunt for high temp components. It also says components may work at high temperatures, but lifetime limited.
Boy, that's right, Brent. I remember when we started with MWD, we would get the highest temperature components that you could find working in Schlumberger in the 1970s, and that was mil-spec components. It went into the 80s, and we would buy mil-spec 125C, which is low temperature. 125C components were available. The so-called high reliability military components you could buy, but they never really went above that. Everybody was looking for a mil standard high reliability rated 150C and then 175C and 200C. Well, the military went away from that because they went to what they called costs. The military was under cost restrictions as well. So COS, commercial off-the-shelf components, became a big deal. Back in the late 80s, early 90s, all of a sudden, our ability to even pay the extra cost and get the established reliability tested high reliability military components that went away. They were already costly, but now they just weren't available because the military itself said, we're going to use commercial off the shelf and we're going to start doing module testing and then system testing to verify that it still works, even though we've got components operating beyond their rated specs. So they have big high volumes. Automotive has even higher volumes. Oil field has very niche volumes.
All right, keep going with the questions here. Wisdom says, what about if MWD tool, what about if a MWD tool could compute the real-time depth and work with embedded trained AI to reach target? So essentially, this would be the MWD tool knows what depth it's at, because that's the only measurement that takes place down hole that we don't have, or takes place at surface that we don't have down hole is depth. And then I'm guessing to further what he's saying here is that this is integrated with some sort of RSS system that then can have the well pre-programmed into it to essentially, as he says here, AI to reach target. What are your thoughts?
Absolutely. It's a great idea. One of my mentors at Baker Hughes, Volker Kruger, had a patent on that exact same thing, which was a smart MWD worm that could worm itself away. You provide this device with sensors and actuators and power. You program it and say, this is what we want you to do. We want you to drill to a certain target using these sensors and let it go. Well, the main thing it doesn't know is depth, a long hole depth. Today and 40 years ago, the number one unknown measurement, the poorest measurement that we have is depth. We don't know where the hell the bit is. We don't know how deep it is. And that's part of the problem. We can measure lots of angles, lots of facts about what is around us, but we don't know the depth. So Volker Kruger had a patent that said that we're going to do just that. We're going to make some measurements along the way about how we incrementally move. If we moved an inch, we're going to add that to our depth. We moved another inch, and there are ways to measure that based on acoustic reflections or other observations of the borehole wall against a known set of spacings on a sensor. And you can accumulate these incrementals and you can add that together. You don't need artificial intelligence, just a standard von Neumann code that's going to accumulate. You can do that. What you don't know is how much it's going to drift, and it's inaccurate. And the drift, the inaccuracy in the accumulation of the little incremental depths for a downhole tool ends up being worse than the known depth from the surface. If the known depth from the surface is only accurate to 1 part in 1,000, that means at 10,000 feet, we could be off by 10 feet. We are, typically. That's what goes on. There was a time, well, just in the Utah Forge, the second well that's being drilled in Utah for the enhanced geothermal system. That second well, the depth just a couple of weeks ago was off by wireline depth, and drill pipe measured depth was anywhere from 7 to 17 feet different. And nobody worried about that because that's standard. That's standard to the industry. When you're down around 10,000 feet, you're going to be perhaps 5 to 10 feet off, and it happens. You can get better, more accurate depth, but you have to look at what you're willing to pay to do that. So the concept is very good. It's been patented before. I've been fortunate to get 30 patents in the industry in a variety of areas. Measuring depth is always very key to any of these measurement systems.
If you're interested in a conversation about depth, I did an episode with Harold Bolt. So there's plenty to be able to consume in that episode. So feel free to go back. I always thought it was interesting if, all the information that we're sending uphole, we already have it downhole. If we could just send the depth from surface to downhole instead of it being a one-way street, maybe a two-way street, be able to send that downhole, and then, something like this could actually work out. But don't want to derail that. We'll go ahead here to Dale's questions. How do you see the advancement of geothermal to the energy basket in all forms, from district heat loops to reuse of oil wells for energy production and energy storage?
Geothermal is growing. There's a lot of interest in it now. Much of that is because there is available technology and technologists from hydrocarbon that are translating to availability for geothermal. It's a pet project now with the Department of Energy. They're funding a number of projects, and I think it's going to continue to be important. But one of the things that sticks with me and should stick with you in your mind is that when you look at the value of the product, Kate Baker on the stat team for the Utah Forge EGS geothermal project had a way of putting it. She said, when you produce fluid from a well, and at the surface you get a barrel of oil, what's the value of that barrel of oil? Well, depending upon the price of oil, it may be $70, $80, $100. You have produced fluid from the well, it's at the surface, it's worth $100. You produce a barrel of hot water. Maybe the hot water is native to the formation. Maybe it was circulated down through an enhanced geothermal exchange system. Maybe it went down through a closed loop, advanced geothermal system from an injector and then coming out on the other side. However you get it, you get this barrel of hot water at the surface. And what's it worth? Well, the calculations at the time were somewhere between $1 and $3 a barrel. Well, that's a significant difference, right? 1 or 2 orders of magnitude difference in the value of the volume product. But then the key thing that Kate said, and this will stick with me forever, the next day, what is the value of that barrel of oil? Well, it's still $70 to $100, whatever the price of oil is. The next day, what's the value of the barrel of hot water? 0, because it's no longer hot water. It's no longer steam. It has a finite lifetime, and that implies that it's got to be produced at the right place, at the right time, and consumed efficiently. That's the key thing that's the limiter for geothermal, that you can produce oil and transport it by pipeline to anywhere that needs it. You can store it, but you can't do that with hot water geothermal. It has to be produced and used and displaced at the appropriate location that needs it.
Sounds like a very interesting person to potentially have on the show here. Great insight there. Let's see here. We still got let's say Friday once the conferences we're done real-time depth. I think that's it for all of the questions. I think. Oh wait, no. Here's another question from Daryl. How will AI be able to be utilized for faster data rates?
I can't predict exactly how it will be used, but I can point out that in almost every decade in the past 5, one of the industries that has been the chief users of high-tech, high-end computing engines and coders has been the oil field industry. You look back in the 70s and 80s, the big supercomputers were being bought by the Shells and the BPs and the Exxons and the Mobils. Their data centers were state of the art. And it's only in the past couple of decades that you see the Googles and the Microsofts that have stores of computers and banks and computing horsepower that exceed that of the oil field. So the need is there, the capability is there, the interest is there, and not only the hardware, the computing hardware, but the algorithms, the artificial intelligence and machine language is also there. There's been the desire for that. And in 1984 in Salt Lake City, Christianson Diamond, we employed a team of experts from California to come in they were from Berkeley. And they said, we're going to introduce you to Lisp computers. These Lisp parallel processing computers are going to revolutionize the industry for oil field as well as for other industries because they can do things much faster. They can take all of the algorithms that they want and implement it much faster. And we actually went out and hired an oil field industry expert, Preston Moore, who had written the book on drilling. He's a drilling technology expert. We had him hired and in place there for interviews with this Lisp processor team from Berkeley for about 2 weeks in Salt Lake City. And the interview generated a number of algorithms and they implemented this. And basically it went nowhere. Why did it go nowhere? Well, because there's so much to it. There's more than one rule, and people are learning more technology every day. Our industry is expanding. Communications technology is expanding. Artificial intelligence and machine learning has progressed so much since 1984. That was 40 years ago. I mean, think about it. 40 years ago. In 40 years, we have much better algorithms, much better art. Chat GPT. Nobody would have ever believed something would be so capable 40 years ago. So yes, it's going to evolve. Yes, we're going to use it. Why not?
Good point. Well, Robert, thank you so much for being on the show today. I've got one more question for you. With the advent of so much of the geothermal projects and people wanting to drill on these and needing high temp MWD tools, do you think that there could be a resurgence of a more mechanical system that goes back to the single shots or multi shots where you're either taking a picture or punching a hole in a piece of paper and being able to use that as the recording mechanism for not wells that are like 200 or 225, but these excessively hot wells that 300 degrees C, 400 degrees C, where electronic components or batteries are just not going to be able to do the trick. Do you think there's a possibility there?
In a way, yes, but we're regressing. What happens is that because with geothermal, just like with hydrocarbon, your goal is to expose your production borehole, your cased borehole, say, to the reservoir and the target. So if the target is hot water or even hot rock, the deeper you go, the hotter the rock, then the ideal for a lot of these technologies, whether it's enhanced geothermal with a fracture network through the rock, or whether it's advanced geothermal with a closed loop piping going down through, like the Ever type. These are all encouraged and enhanced by getting deeper, by getting hotter, by getting more spread out, and yet connecting together those pieces. I mean, if you have one end that goes in and around like this and has a heat exchange network, it's got miles of pipe exposed, it's still got to get back to the surface. It's got to join back at the right place to the surface. Guiding that is impossible to be done with a wireline single shot deployment because we're very far from the vertical, far from the simple systems. But there are combinations, there are compromises. So yes, there are going to be closed loop systems, which would be called not advanced geothermal. Say Greenfire has a system where you you pump water down, and you come back in the same borehole. Well, if you come back up in the same borehole to the surface, then your goal is to get deep and hot, and you don't really care if it meanders left and right. So you don't need the advanced guidance techniques. So for those simple advanced geothermal systems where the goal is only to get deep and hot and you don't really need to steer it so much, then you don't need the high temperature electronics. But for all of the other approaches, you do need to have the smarts, the high temperature electronics, in order to get smart modules that can do smart guidance.
As well as being able to, as things that I've been told and read about, is that the cost is probably one of the most big prohibitive things for geothermal drilling, is just, and you're right, if it's taken that long to be able to do single shots, then maybe it's not the right solution. So there we go. Robert, thank you so much for being on the show today. I really, really do appreciate it. Let's give away a drill bit here real quick. Pull this up. StreamYard giveaway tool. There we go. Put that. Go back here. Here we go. So everybody that's still watching, we do appreciate it. We had 46 entries. Had a lot of people watching today and a lot of comments. Really do appreciate it. Still 45 people watching. Actually, probably 48. And there we go. Craig Brown is the winner today. Craig, thank you so much. Do appreciate you tuning in and watching. Take that one off. There we go. I've got Craig's info, so I'll get in touch with him and get that over to him. Once again, Robert, thank you so much for being on the show today. I hope you have yourself a wonderful, wonderful weekend, and look forward to potentially seeing you soon at one of the industry events. I know you'll probably be still attending some of the IADC or IADD or some of the other events. And thank you for all that you have done in the industry as well, sir.
Thanks for having me on the show, David. You do a wonderful service to the industry, and I'm honored to have been here. Thank you.
Well, thank you, guys. All right, for everybody out there watching, tune in probably in a couple of Fridays. Next Friday, I'll be in Alaska. We'll probably get something set up for the week after that. I've still got to do some work on that. But thank you guys all so much for being here on this wonderful, wonderful Friday. Let me see if I can find the button for the closeout. And as always, know your industry.